Jazz, beignets, Bourbon Street, and ghosts. It's hard to say which one New Orleans is more famous for.
From dead orphans pulling on bedsheets to a dead man dangling from the very balconies that make this city so recognizable, it's easy to see why the French Quarter is one of the most haunted locales in the U.S. Here are 6 haunted tales, some true, some legend, to keep you up at night and add some terror to your next visit to the Crescent City.
Let's start right here in Jackson Square, which, once upon a time, served as the city's execution site.
In 1725, an enslaved man named Louis Congo, a name given to him by his enslavers, by the way, was offered an impossible choice.
He was given the option to either remain enslaved or earn his freedom by becoming the city's executioner. His duties, beyond executing people, included whippings, brandings, and amputations. And it was all done publicly to deter other people from committing the same crimes. People would gather right here in Jackson Square in order to see the punishments and executions being handed out. And of course, the French governor had chosen a black man, believing that it would be humiliating to white criminals to be executed or punished by a black man, and also a deterrent to those enslaved people attempting to escape if they knew they would be meeting someone with the same skin color there on the executioner's platform. Louis Congo became especially famous for torturing people on the executioner's wheel. This was a ship's wheel laid sideways. A person would be tied to it, and the ship would be spun slowly, while all of their bones were broken by the executioner's cudgel. To this day, if you come out to the square at night, you may hear the groans of people being tormented in their final hours. You may also feel cold spots lingering around the square, and watch out for the apparition of Louis Congo, because make no mistake, even though he was granted his freedom, his life was far from free. He was used as a pawn and a symbol at the city's expense. New Orleans has a dark reputation as the largest open market for slave sales in the United States in the first part of the 1800s. Slave catchers worked as what we'd call independent contractors throughout different countries in Western Africa. And they would sell the people they kidnapped to companies running ships to countries like England and the United States. Those ships carrying kidnapped individuals docked here. They would enter the Gulf, come up the Mississippi River, and dock at the port of New Orleans. Large auction houses would sell off these kidnapped people for a fee or even a cut of the sales price. The luxury hotel, now known as the Omni Hotel, sits on the grounds of what used to be the St. Louis Hotel, one of the largest of these auction houses. Interested parties could wine and dine while viewing the latest merchandise coming off of one of these slave ships. Men, women, even children were stood up between pillars inside the main foyer of the St. Louis and shown off like artwork or livestock. Though there was a law in New Orleans left over from French rule stating that families could not be divided and sold, it wasn't always followed, and once they left New Orleans, well, there was really no guarantee of what would happen. This was a place of great human suffering, hidden behind the facade of a luxurious party. Today, in the Omni, cold spots can be felt around the hallways. Crying and groaning disembodied voices can be heard all throughout the building. The partially formed apparitions of African Americans can be seen walking on different floors of the hotel without any obvious destination. And whenever people try to interact with them, they vanish. These spirits are trapped in a heartbreaking cycle, repeating some of the worst moments of their lives. Neglect destroyed much of the original hotel, which was ultimately torn down in 1917. But this part, right here, remains true to the original structure. Above the arched windows, you'll notice the word change. This was originally part of the full word exchange for St. Louis Hotel and Exchange, where they traded, sold, and exchanged goods, money, and people. Our next haunted story is more local legend than history. The French Quarter is famous for its architecture, with wrought iron balconies on closely built homes, filled with hanging planters. But did you know these can also turn deadly? Many of these homes have balconies topped with spikes known locally as Romeo catchers. Their purpose in the 1800s was to prevent young men from climbing up to visit their girlfriends late at night after their parents had gone to bed. The story goes that late one night, a young woman told her parents that she was feeling very ill and couldn't go out with them that evening. They had some outing planned. So she stayed home, they went out, and of course, as soon as they were gone, she signaled to her boyfriend to come up. According to the legend, her father came home unexpectedly, having forgotten something, and he surprised the young lovers. The boyfriend went out the window and over the balcony, while the father ran to get his gun. Now, when he came back, his intention wasn't to shoot the boyfriend, but only to scare him. And he fired his pistol out into the air over the young man's head. Well, it worked. He scared him. The young man slipped, fell, and was unfortunately caught and impaled on the Romeo catchers. Some even say potentially disemboweled. The local police, it is said, had a very difficult time pulling his body down from off of the Romeo catchers. Now, you'll find them all over the city. They're very common in the architecture, but the actual home in question is on Orleans Street. The owner of the home says that sometimes at night they hear the balcony creaking, the wrought iron moving as though somebody is climbing up one of the posts and coming over. Sometimes they hear footsteps walking back and forth on the upper gallery. And some of the neighbors say that on full moonlit evenings, they see blood and other things hanging, dripping from the Romeo catchers. What do you think? Is this true or merely local legend? Welcome to the Andrew Jackson Hotel, site of one of the most active hauntings in New Orleans. The difference between an active and a residual haunting is that in a residual haunting, apparitions appear, but they don't interact with visitors. They're caught in a loop, replaying some of their most tragic moments. In an active haunting, spirits interact with the people who see them. Residual hauntings are most often found at the sites of great tragedy, like the Omni Hotel. Here at the Andrew Jackson Hotel, the spirits are most definitely ready to play. This was originally the location of an orphanage in the late 1700s. At that time, keep in mind, there were no indoor toilets or indoor sewage systems. This is important to know. That meant that waste was literally dumped into sewage channels running along the sides of the streets. Because the land here lies so low, this meant that those sewage channels never fully drained. They became ideal breeding grounds for mosquitoes, which carried yellow fever, and the city typically experienced small epidemics every summer. The illness starts as a fever and grows to a headache. Body chills and nausea and vomiting often follow. Now, many people successfully recover at this point, but for those who don't, jaundice follows, along with bleeding from the eyes and the mouth. Death occurs with organ failure. The disease ravaged the city's population every summer, due in large part to the fact that they didn't understand how it was spreading. Some accounts say the bodies could be piled as high as 7, and they would linger in the streets until the corpse wagons could come around and pick them up. This was prior to the building of the St. Louis Cemetery, so these bodies were driven to mass graves outside of the city. Sadly, this left many children orphaned, who were then taken here. Unfortunately, in 1794, a fire tore through the French Quarter when a group of small children playing in a courtyard, similar to the one behind me, started a small fire on accident. It was very dry that summer, and the wind picked it up and carried it through the city. When it was finally laid to rest, over 200 buildings had been burned, and 5 children had lost their lives right here. Now, the legend goes that the children still linger. Many guests report their items being moved around their room, their blankets and pillows being tugged on during the night, and the owners are said to even keep a small box of toys on hand to interest the children. Some people have even reported hearing childlike laughter in the hallways. This is easily one of the most active documented hauntings in the French Quarter, and quite possibly the French Quarter's most haunted hotel. Stay here on your next visit, if you dare. Our next story is easily among the more grim and quite possibly most gruesome of those we're going to cover here in New Orleans. This is the LaLaurie Mansion. It sits at the corners of Royal and Governor Nichols Street, built in 1832 by Madame Marie Delphine LaLaurie, who was the daughter of a grand, wealthy family with very high social standing. She married Dr. LaLaurie and was on her 3rd marriage at the time. If you're impressed by its size and opulence, well, that's because you're meant to be. Though the home is not now, nor has it ever been, open to the public for tours, what we can see are 3 stories wrapped in wrought iron balconies. What we can't see is an indoor courtyard, 12,000 square feet of rooms, and a grand parlor where New Orleans elite were hosted at wonderful soirees. 2 years after it was completed, in 1834, a fire started in the kitchen. City volunteers arrived to extinguish the fire, but it had already done significant damage to the house. What they found in the burnt walls and the wreckage nauseated them. Like many in the wealthy class, the LaLauries owned slaves. But Madame LaLaurie wasn't just putting them to work inside the house. She was also using them for sadistic torture and medically questionable experiments. In fact, prior to the fire, 2 of her slaves had jumped from the roof of the home, rather facing death than live one more moment in her torture chamber of a home. Upon entering the home, rescuers found a Black enslaved woman chained to the kitchen stove. She confessed immediately she had started the fire, and she had done it as a suicide attempt. They moved upstairs and found slaves chained by the neck in the attic above the kitchen. Their arms and legs had been pulled from their sockets, and worse, their eyes had been gouged out. They had been kept alive, but only so that the torture could continue. Medical experiments had been performed on others by Dr. LaLaurie. He'd broken bones and set them at the wrong angle, intentionally, just to see what would happen. He even attempted gender reassignment surgery. Badly. Sometimes with animal parts. He'd even flayed skin on live individuals just so he could see the inner workings underneath. The mansion was ultimately restored after the fire, but no one ever seems to own it for very long. One owner ended up in an insane asylum. Another landed in a coma. Nicolas Cage even owned it, briefly, for about 2 years, before he was convicted of tax evasion and lost it in foreclosure. This is known as the LaLaurie curse. To this day, the spirits of 2 African Americans can be seen leaping from the roof of the home to their death down below on certain nights. Chains can be heard dragging along the floorboards of the upper stories. Groans and even screams occasionally echo throughout the house. And a very few have reported the apparition of a large African man draped in chains standing at the top of the attic stairs. As for the LaLauries, they escaped during the chaos following the fire, as mob anger and justice spread over the city. They moved instead to Paris, where there was no legal extradition at the time. Let's be clear, though. Had they stayed, the worst penalty they were facing were fines and the potential loss of their social standing. What they did was not against the law at the time, because slaves were considered property and not people. What they feared was mob violence and the people who were disgusted by the news reports coming out about what was found in the attic. And sadly, treating slaves with brutality was not limited to the LaLauries. To anyone's knowledge, the LaLauries never faced justice for their horrific crimes. Not in this life, at least. Our final ghost story brings us to the oldest building in the Mississippi Valley. This is the Ursuline Convent, located on Charter Street between Ursuline Avenue and Governor Nichols Street. It was founded in 1727 as a convent that provided a school for girls, some light medical treatment, and a mission to Native Americans. It was also the first orphanage in the United States. This became the first home for young French women traveling to the colonies in search of husbands. They ultimately became known as the Casket Girls. These women put everything they owned in small trunks, also called caskets. They were sent specifically by the King of France, who took his duty very seriously to protect their moral purity. So he ordered they be locked below decks on the ship during the voyage over. They were never allowed above decks. This led, predictably, to severe deficiencies in vitamin C and D. When they disembarked, they were very pale and sickly looking, and their gums had begun to draw back from their teeth, making their teeth appear long and fang-like. I think you know where I'm headed with this. The colonists feared them like monsters, and the nuns took them quickly to the Ursuline Convent and put them in the attic on the 3rd floor for their safekeeping. At that time, if you'll remember from our previous stories, the city was regularly experiencing blights of yellow fever, including during the time of the girls' arrival. The pile of corpses in the streets created a smell that hovered over the city and led to its nickname as the City of the Dead. This predates the building of St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, so mass graves were common in use at the time. Because the bodies were piled in the streets, people had a lot of opportunity to look at them and even study them for the more macabre. Rumors began to spread that not all of the bodies looked as though they had died from yellow fever, In fact, some said a few of the corpses had their throats ripped out. The bodies even looked as though they had been drained entirely of blood. As rumors began to circulate, others added that they had only ever seen the new arrivals, the casket girls, outside of the convent walls at night. People began connecting these wild stories without any proof. Others began to wonder where the girls stayed during the daytime, and some suggested that the very caskets they'd brought over were in fact their daytime dwellings. To quell these rumors, the nuns entered the third-floor attic room, but they found that the girls had fled during the night. They then opened the caskets the girls had left behind, but they found them completely empty. This was all that the colonists needed to connect all of the rumors. The girls were surely vampires. They'd been sleeping in their caskets in the third-floor attic room during the day and tearing out the throats of citizens during the night. The nuns, not knowing how to handle the situation, decided to lock up the third-floor attic rooms. They sealed the girls' caskets with blessed silver nails and used those same silver nails to permanently cut off the attic. They assumed the troubles were over, but there have always been mysterious deaths in the French Quarter. Who's to say the casket girls didn't find new coffins to sleep in, or that they don't continue to haunt the dark streets looking for victims even to this day? And so, the legend of vampires walking the streets of New Orleans persists even to this day. Thanks so much for joining me on this spooky tour down the historic streets of one of my absolute favorite cities. Next time you're in town, take a stroll through haunted Jackson Square. But be careful, look behind you, and make sure you're not being followed by pale girls with long teeth. I'll see you in the next one. Happy haunting.